If you weren't here last week, Ruth is a phenomenal story in the Old Testament. It is a story that begins with Ruth and Naomi and Orpah. Naomi is the mother-in-law in this story, and her husband dies, and she has her two daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Naomi, and their husbands also die, and they're left there alone. And so Naomi turns to these two daughters and she says to them, go back to your homelands, go back to your mothers, and ask your mothers to receive you, that you might have somebody that can care for you. One of the women, Orpah, goes back, and the other one, Ruth, turns and says to Naomi, do not ask me to leave you. Wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God, and where you go, I will go, and there I will be buried. She commits herself to Naomi. In large part, many scholars believe because Naomi is too frail and feeble to really care for herself. And Ruth recognizes that without some sort of help or assistance, she will likely die. And so Ruth commits herself to Naomi. And they leave from the land that they are living in, the land of Moab, and they go back to Bethlehem. And they go back to Bethlehem, and that's where we pick up the story here this week. There they are in Bethlehem, and Naomi is sitting there at the edge of town, and Ruth is there with her, and Ruth turns to her and says, let me go into the fields and begin to glean. You see, it was a practice, it was a law there in the Old Testament through Leviticus and Deuteronomy that when you harvested the grains of the fields, that whatever was left behind the first time that you passed through was left on the field floor. The grain that was left behind, perhaps the wheat that they dropped onto the floor, the things that were there were left for the widow and the orphan, the poor and the alien, that they could come on a second pass through and pick up what was left over and that they could eat off of it. It was kind of a social safety net so that these people who were on the fringes of society were not left there, but that they too could have something to eat. And so Ruth gets up this morning and she goes and she's working her way through the field. And it says there in chapter 2 that as she's working her way through the field, she comes to the portion of the field that belongs to Boaz. Now Boaz is this man, it says, this man of great stature, this man of great wealth, a man of great power who has been able through this period of famine to actually amass his own land and his own wealth. And he looks out in this field and he sees Ruth. And he asks, hey, who's that? Who does she belong to? He asks one of his workers, and the worker turns and says, oh, well, that's Ruth. You know, that woman that came back from Moab with Naomi. And he turns and he says to his worker, when she goes through the field, don't stop her. Don't bother her. Don't molest her. Leave her be. And in fact, tell the other workers to drop some more grain on the ground, to drop some more wheat that she might be able to pick it up. And then he goes a step further and he invites her over to their meal. They're about to break for lunch, and it says that she's been on her feet all day long, working through the field, trying to get whatever is left behind. And he invites her to come and eat with him and the other workers. And he begins to talk with her, and he begins to hear her story. He begins to listen as she tells him the story of Naomi and where she's come from and what she's done and where she's been. And it says that she has food there and she eats until she is satisfied. Now, she's been living in a land trying to take care of this woman on her own. It's been a long time since she has eaten until she was satisfied. And then Boaz gives her all of the leftover food that they have there at the table. He hands it to her and he tells her to come back. He says, don't go into any of the other fields. Just come to this one. Pick up what you need. You won't be bothered if you come here to get the things that you need to survive. And so Ruth goes and she picks up all of the grain that's there and she takes it back to Naomi, her mother-in-law. And she has these bushels, these massive bushels worth that she goes back home with, and Naomi is overjoyed. She said, where did you go today that you found all of this food? Where did you go today that you found all of these grains? And she tells him, oh, it was Boaz. And she says, blessed be the Lord. Blessed be God who has not forsaken us If you were here last week, you know that the end of chapter 1 ends with Naomi saying to the people that are around her as she comes back into the city, and they say, well, isn't this Naomi? Isn't this the woman who left and married that man and moved off to the other country? And she says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, because God has dealt with me very bitterly. And Mara means bitterness. And now, after she sees this, she said, blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken us. And then she turns and she says, well, who is the man's field that you were out gleaning in today? And she says, oh, it was this man named Boaz. And all of a sudden something jumps inside of Naomi, and she turns and she says, that is one of our kindred redeemers. You see, a kindred redeemer in the ancient world was a responsibility that fell down to the third and the fourth born male. You see, the firstborn or the secondborn, they would usually get the heir of whatever was to come to them from the family. But the third or the fourth born, they were responsible for taking care of the others who perhaps might fall through the cracks, whose husbands had died, the widows, the orphans, the aliens that were left in the world. And it's interesting here because time and time again when we come and we look at this passage, it is often referred to that Boaz is the redeemer. Boaz is the phenomenal hero of the story. He provides food for her, he welcomes her in, he tells her that she can come back into the field and she can get whatever she needs, and that when she gets what she needs, she can go and leave and come and go as she pleases. It's an interesting read of the story, but it's not exactly accurate. You see, the interesting thing about this, it says that she gathers together these bushels. She gathers together enough bushels that she goes back to Naomi with. And the amount that she actually gathers, really, it's not enough. It's just enough. It's just enough to get by. It's enough to last two people probably about 3.5 weeks. And it's the harvest period. There's only really 2 harvest periods that occur throughout the year there. And so really at best, the best that Ruth can really hope for here, if Boaz lets her come and glean in the field, if Boaz is willing to let her come and eat and take from the grain that they have there, she's good for probably 2, 3, maybe 4 months. But the other 6 or 8 months of the year, she's still left to fend for herself. She's left on her own. The best that Ruth can hope for in her current circumstance and current situation is to be fed for 1/3 of the year. That's the best. But then Naomi shows up on the scene. The same Naomi who was abandoned, the same Naomi who says that God has forsaken her, the same Naomi who lost her husband and her sons, the same Naomi who has seemingly lost everything, comes onto the scene. And at the end of the chapter, she said, Boaz is one of my kindred redeemers. You see, Naomi was too old to be married into Boaz. Naomi couldn't come into the system there to have Boaz come and take care of her, but Ruth could. You see, Ruth, as we are seeing foreshadowed here, can go to Boaz. Ruth can be properly redeemed, and as such, Naomi can have somebody attached to her. They both can have that support system that saves them. And most every commentary piece that's out here will tell you that Boaz really is the hero, right? Boaz is the redeemer of this story. But I would argue something different. I would argue that the true redeemer of the story is actually Naomi. The true redeemer of the story is the one who creates the link between Ruth and Boaz. The true redeemer of the story is the one who accepts Naomi as the outsider and brings her into the inside. You see, when Boaz comes and he invites Ruth to the table, he's doing something kind of phenomenal. He doesn't stop and say, hey, come with me and let's go off to the side over here. I think you're kind of cute. Let's go get some dinner. He doesn't do that. He says, come and join and eat with us. He opens up the communal table where everybody else and all the other workers are eating, and he invites her to be a part of the world that they are living in. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing, I think, because it reveals to us the truth of how we are to live our life. I have a friend of mine who is a colleague in ministry. He used to be serving as a pastor here in town. And one of his parishioners was sick for a long time. She was in hospice care, and she was in the hospital, and he heard that she was dying. Her daughter had called him up and said, I think my mother's about to pass. Would you be willing to come and sit with us during this time? And so he goes over to the hospital and he says a prayer and he sits in the chair and he's there on the side of the room and he says he remembers praying to himself, God, would you be visible here? Would you make yourself manifest here? Would you reveal your presence here among us now? And then he says he heard ever so softly the parishioner who was on the hospital bed make a noise. They called the nurse in and asked what she needed because they didn't really know. And the nurse goes up and she puts her ear to her and she hears the woman say, I'm thirsty. And so the nurse goes over and she gets this little sponge thing that they keep over on the side and she fills it with water and she presses it up against her lips. And instantly, my friend stops and he says, I didn't realize when I was praying for God to show up, that God would show up where I least expected it. You see, instinctively, he immediately remembered the moment when Jesus was on the cross and he says, I thirst. And so a guard goes and he gets a sponge and he fills it with vinegar and he puts it on Jesus' lips and helps him to drink. Even within this story, there's something beautiful within that moment. The moment that Ruth is invited to sit at the table with all the other people there, it says that she takes a piece of bread and she dips it into the sour wine and she eats it. There's a beautiful foreshadowing of what it means to come to this table, what it means to come to a table and to feel and see and know the presence of the living God, to be welcomed and accepted even as an outsider. It's beautiful statements of who and what we do when we are willing to show up. You see, in Sunday school this morning, we were talking about how this passage is really amazing because it lives in this contrast. It lives in this contrast of God moving and us acting. Because you see, when we are willing to participate within the action of God, beautiful things happen. Amazing things happen. God shows up in the least and the most unexpected places. God makes himself manifest when we are willing to take just a few steps. We said in the Sunday school class that it was required for Ruth to get up and go to the field. She had to do some of the work. She had to get out into the field and begin to glean through the field and go and pick up the grain. She had to go and do those things, but even beyond that, she needed something else. She needed something more. She needed grace. She needed the moving of the hand of God to manifest itself in an amazing and incredible way that we could not possibly expect or do. And I think the same is true for us today, that we are required to get up and to act, to be and to do, to live in the midst of those that are around us. And in the middle of that, God somehow shows up in the most unordinary places. One of the things that I think is really beautiful about part of this passage here about being an outsider and an insider is that there are times in our lives where I think each and every one of us can feel like outsiders. There are times when each one of us feels like we maybe don't belong, like maybe there's a whole system and a semblance of things that are going on that we can't really participate or be a part of. Last night I was staying up late and I was watching 13 Hours, the story of Benghazi. And it was real interesting. At one point in the movie, there is a point where one of the soldiers who's there, and he keeps seeing all the movements happening with all the Libyan armed forces, and he says, do you feel like everybody else seems to know what the plan is except for us? I think there's times in our lives where we often feel like that. Or maybe it feels like everybody and everywhere else has plans that seem to make sense except us. Like we're the ones who are sitting on the outside, the ones who are not welcomed, perhaps the poor, the widow, the orphan, the alien who's gleaning through the fields, just trying to get enough just to get by. You see, Ruth showed up that day to glean a little bit of grain from the field, to get just enough food to make it to the next day, but God showed up to give her more than she could possibly fathom or imagine. She showed up just to get enough sustenance for a day, but God showed up to tell her that he could provide for her entire lifetime. And I think God speaks the same truth into our lives today. In that same movie, there was one moment where one soldier who sits there and he loves reading all of these books on philosophy, and One of his other soldier friends came up and he said, "Enlighten me, tell me something that will motivate me today." And he says to him, "You have within you all the power of God and all the power of evil, all the potential of hell and all the potential of heaven inside of you." I think the same truth resonates with each and every one of us. You have within yourself all of the potential of God's greatness or all the potential of evil in the world, and what you choose to do with it today is how God is going to move in this world. So where is God telling you to show up? Where is God asking you to glean today? Where is God asking you to go and move and make the Spirit and the kingdom of God manifest here on earth? Because just like Naomi and Ruth, if we open our eyes to the moving of the Spirit, we see that God shows up in the most unexpected places, but in the most extraordinary ways. Thanks be to God. Amen.